In the small hour before dawn, when the world still breathes like a sleeping thing, a sound came to the house that was not wind nor rain. It was a tiny, patient petition, the soft, repeated pleading of a creature that had learned the language of waiting. The woman in the house, who had learned grief as a habit, turned the pillow and listened. She had become an island of careful movements, kettle, cupboard, closed rooms that held memory like a thick curtain. Her days were measured by what she forbore to touch. The petition came again, a tap of hope against the glass of the back door. It was not an urgent demand, but the steady rhythm of a heart that had chosen this house as seat of its longing. She imagined, with a tenderness she had not thought hers to feel, a small perseverance, one that refused abandonment. The sound placed a question into the silence. Whoever will reach for me? Whoever will answer when all else declines? In answering that question lies the choice that turns habit into story, and loneliness into something else. It was a moment thin as paper and wide as mercy. Come closer. There are lives built of little imitations of living. A chair pulled in every morning as if to invite company that never comes. A teapot kept warm for a hand that no longer lifts it. Zara kept hers like that. The house she lived in had been a home once, a thing assembled with names and mornings and the clink of plates. And then it had been learned by sorrow until sorrow wore it like an old coat. She moved through rooms with the same quiet exactitude as the clock that would not run. She did not hurry, for there was nowhere she needed to go hurriedly anymore and nothing that required haste. Grief had settled into the hinges of doors and made of them slow things. Neighbors saw a dame who kept to her small garden and a narrow list of errands. They saw her on market mornings with a shawl about her shoulders, buying only what could be eaten within a day because she preferred the tiny certainties of present consumption. They saw sometimes the way she paused by the potted plant on her sill, a plant that was not very well tended, a geranium with one stubborn leaf and a crooked stem, and they supposed it was mere habit. They did not guess the meanings she threaded through that green thing, a promise kept to no one and yet kept still. Kipling might have called it a moral habit, or perhaps that should not be his to say now. Zara called it memory. The plant had been a gift long before she learned to greet the mornings alone. Whenever she watered it, she said a name under her breath and felt less like a woman adrift. It stood in a chipped pot beneath the window that looked upon the lane, and when the plant sighed, as plants do in summer, she believed the sound to be a language that answered some of the empty rooms. The single green shoot that refused to die became a small oracle. When winter came and leaves fell and friendless things curled under the steps, that green shoot remained, and Zara, with the slow worship of people who perform rites to keep the dead near, tended it. She was a woman made of soft rituals rather than large actions. She had maps of places that no longer mattered tucked away in drawers, and a photograph folded twice of a man whose hands were a memory as distinct as the scent of cardamom. In the evening she would set a cup of tea where another cup might once have been. Sometimes she would speak into the hush as if the house itself were a listener. The neighbors said she was odd or quaint or better left to herself. They did not understand how grief arranges itself into the latticework of daily living so quietly that outside voices never perceive it. Into such a silence a cat cannot be indifferent. But the cat did not arrive with trumpets or proclamations. It arrived as all true visitors arrive, by what it does. It folded itself into the house's habits with the patience of a thing that knows the slow art of persuasion. The first evening Zara heard a muted rasp at the back door, a sound like a string pulled across a wood floor. She opened the door to a narrow wedge of dark and the small weight of something seated on the step, not asking aloud but asking by its posture. May I be held? It did not push nor did it demand. It merely held still, as if offering itself as a question for her to answer. She watched it from the threshold, seeing only manners and movement. The creature rubbed once along the frame as if to set itself in place, as if the door were a world and it wished to be kept within its span. It pressed its head against the hem of the shawl that bridged house and outside and then drew back, waiting. Zara found she could not step away. The sound of the thing's breathing threaded the quiet like a small bell. In that bell she heard foolishly the echo of other hands. She did not at first take the cat inside. She had learned to stop beginning things, but she did not shut the door either. Night after night the pattern became a part of the hours, a waiting, a subtle insistence. The cat would come when the dusk made the garden a place for small shadows and linger where the lamp's circle ended. It would sit calmly on the low wall, and when a dog barked or a child's ball skittered past, it would not flee. Instead, it would blink, as if measuring the weather of the world, and then resume its patient watch. The neighbors, however, were quick to make judgments about patient things. There is in every street a certain tribunal that passes sentence on life that does not belong to the list of useful possessions. The baker's wife called it a mangy stray. The grocer's boy, with a young man's cruelty, swung a broom that said, in a dozen small gestures, that this visitor was improper. "Keep your gates shut," they warned each other, as if gates could keep longing out. The cat was shooed from stoops and shivered away from thresholds. It accepted insults like rain, patient and renewing. It had learned the art of presence that wearied human disapproval into indifference. Zara watched all this from within her square of lamplight. Each dismissal by others was a small arrow into a place she knew well, into the soft old wound where companionship had been cleaved from her life. Yet there was something in the cat's refusal to be deterred that tugged at a seam she had sewn closed long ago. She began, without naming the motion, to place a saucer on the step. She put it not out of decision, but as a tiny bell for the habit of the house. She did not yet touch the thing. She merely made for it a place to be seen. The saucer was an offering, but it was also a test, to measure how much of the world she would permit to approach. A child, who liked theatrics and had no taste for lingering sorrow, saw the saucer and declared that Zara was mad to feed strays. A neighbor took the cat by the scruff once and tossed it aside as if it were a thing without story. The animal reappeared next night, cleaned and calm, as if the city had not put a care into its skin. People who reject are always surprised when what they reject returns. They think rejection is final. The world knows otherwise. Word spread, as such words do, into a kind of gossip, a hungry cat wandering lanes, seeking warmth. It was a small thing for such a large rumor, and yet in small things the heart finds its tests. The cat, to those who watched, seemed to want one thing above all, and to be held. But the world was a place that refused certain wishes. The cat learned the doors that would not open and the arms that would not lift. It learned the cue of a slammed gate and the music of footsteps that meant flight. Zara's house, among others, proved itself a map of refusals. One evening in late September, when leaves had begun to make the gutter sound like paper, the cat came and did something the neighbors had not seen. It pressed its whole small weight against Zara's door and did not move when a boy kicked gravel to make it leave. The boy's boots were loud. The sound echoed down the lane like a trumpeter's folly. The cat merely kept its position, its body a stillness that said with animally dignity, "I will not go until someone decides to keep me." Zara, who had lately learned to keep to the edges of decisions, felt a pull she could not name. She drew the window curtain back with hands that trembled the way someone trembles when remembering a name. In the dim, the cat's silhouette was patient as a promise. Her mind, which had been careful to avoid any enterprise requiring an opening of the heart, found itself unhooked by that simple persistence. She told herself many reasons to let the door stay closed. Each reason was like a paper mask placed over her face, yet there was, behind those reasons, the tired music of her own loneliness calling to a lonely thing. There was also at the window the plant, the geranium with its single green shoot. Zara had said the day before to no one that if the geranium shrugged its head forward as if to reach the air, she would consider that a small miracle. That morning the shoot had leaned just a little toward the outside world. It was not proof, but it was a small sign in a life that had few signs left to trust. She took that sign like a permission, and she walked to the door. Her hands did not move like the hands of someone who acts boldly. They moved like someone who arranges a life into small, reversible choices. She opened the door a sliver. The cat, waiting as it had been, lifted its head as if to say, "Here is the doorway. Decide." Zara did not yet invite it in. She did not yet name it. She only set her palm, trembling and measured, near the handle as if to feel the coolness of a world that had been unchanging for too long. The inciting thing that would bend the line of living came not from a heroic declaration, but from a sound outside the house that had nothing to do with them. The shout of a boy, the echo of an argument, the slap of a palm on a wall, an old man coughing a laugh, the small civic noises that mean people are about their days. In that composite sound, a neighbor put his own fear into motion. He came out to sweep the pavement, and seeing the woman at her door, saw in that moment the possibility of gossip, that she might be succumbing to sentiment, that she might be taking in the stray. He spat on the step and said aloud, more to mark his territory than to speak truth, that there were rules about feeding animals, and that the council fined such charity. He waved a hand as if waving off the law of mercy, and the boy who had been bothering the cat saw a cue. Then, in little acts that were both ordinary and terrible, stones were gathered. It was not one great act of cruelty, it was a series of small, sanctioned refusals. The child threw first, thinking the game a sport. The neighbor followed with a hiss of disapproval wrapped in a pebble. Someone else scolded and then added a shove. The cat, still at the threshold like an argument that would not be silenced, flinched and then curled itself tighter, not to escape, but to endure. That is when Zara stepped out, not with a great cry, nor with a sweeping motion to reform the world. There is no such suddenness in elder hearts, but with two hands that had once been strong and now were raw with long, gentle use. She stooped, not to inspect the animal but to place herself between it and the small missiles of a neighborhood's impatience. Her shawl, the one she wore every evening, fell from her shoulders in the scrabble of movement. She did not mind losing it. She wrapped it with the neatness of someone who had dressed another for bed 1,000 times, about the small body that had been seeking a hand. A hush, odd and complete, fell upon the lane. People do not often see a woman who has learned to be private move like a weather that bends in favor of life. In that hush, Zara held the creature in her arms as if holding a newly apprenticed grief, with tenderness that had the weight of acknowledgement. The animal went still under the shawl, and the shawl took its warmth, and the neighborhood saw in that taking a strange audacity. Something in the air shifted. A measure of common sense that had been deputized into cruelty stumbled on the sight of a woman choosing to break her own solitude. For some, this was indecency. For others, it was pity. For very few, it was recognition. Zara, who had long been careful to keep her life from altering, felt the world bend in a way that said, "A beginning has been made." The plant on the sill, and the geranium, sent up a tiny new tendril as if in answer. It cannot be said that miracles always arrive announced by thunder. Sometimes they come as a woman wrapping a warm shawl about a small, patient heart and choosing, aloud and private, to answer a waiting. If this gentle story touched your heart, subscribing keeps this quiet little corner alive. When a life which had been honed to small, careful ceremonies is interrupted, it does not fall into chaos like a house struck by storm. It alters like a path altered by a single footstep. The change is quiet at first, and then, by degrees, the whole direction is changed. So it was with Zara. The shawl she wrapped about the small body on that lane carried more than warmth. It carried a decision made in the small hours and sealed by the soft weight against her chest. She placed the creature upon her lap as if placing a new, trembling truth into the chair, where grief had sat for so long. At first, the arrangement was prudent. She kept the cat by the hearth near the chair whose arm had once leaned into another life. It walked her rooms like a thing that already knew how to make itself at home, not by claiming, but by attending, padding to the window and pausing to learn the weather of the lane, settling into the hollow of her foot as if to remember the size of her. It had no great show of claiming affection. It gave itself in small economies of touch, a head rub once a day, a blink when she spoke. Such gestures, tiny as seeds, grew into an orchard of obligation. Her sleep changed in the way sleep of the grieving sometimes changes, not into forgetfulness, but into a presence that kept grief from hollowing her. She woke to the cat's breath against her hand, to the small insistive purr that made an honest rhythm in the night. The house, long a museum of restraint, began again to answer. Cups used more than once, a kettle left warm, a scarf unwound. People watch for thunder and miss the rain that falls quietly for weeks. Zara felt rain. Outside, the lane rippled with commentary. The neighbors who had spat words now whispered other ones. Some softened in ways they would not name. Mrs. Khan from the bakery crossed the street with a wrapped loaf and pretended it was for a sale. She left it on the step as if to leave kindness in a small package. The grocer's boy, who had been cruel at first, found excuses to sweep the pavement near Zara's door, and always in the sweep a little extra seed tumbled for the cat. The change was not universal. Mr. Bashir, who kept his veranda tidy of any stray mercy, watched with a hard eye that counts differently than pity counts. The days knit into a new pattern. The cat at first sat by the plant on the sill and took to watch the green leaf. There was something unremarked in this practice that later showed itself to be a small prophecy. The geranium, the one green shoot Zara had kept with a prayer she could never say aloud, began to put on more color. It was idle to call this causal in a world governed by weather, but the heart is not an engineer. It reads meaning into small returns like a mapmaker finding roads. The cat would perch in the shallow light and flick a small paw at the air above the pot as if to salute a companion. Zara named the motion gift in her mind and felt, absurdly, that a promise had been answered. There were nights when fear returned to the edges, white as quick frost. A life which has learned caution tends also to learn suspicion of good things. Zara found herself listening not only for the cat but for the rumors, that municipal inspectors would fine anyone aiding strays, that stray catchers came in vans with nets and the law on their sides, that taking in an animal invited trouble that multiplied. The city has many laws, and a dozen of them are always ready to prove the cruelty of mercy when the opportunity presents. Her pulse would quicken at the sound of a van, and she would draw the curtain as if by shutting the world out she could keep what she had kept. She drew lines. At the window she would sometimes hold the cat to her face and, for a breath or two, let itself be her proof. It warmed her in a way that no neighbor's kindness could. Yet her caution taught her to plan. She visited the small clinic down the lane on the third morning after bringing it home, balancing the cat in a basket with a shawl draped so it would not be frightened by the city's noise. The practice was old and thinly appointed. The vet, Dr. Hamid, was a man whose hands had the calm of a clock. He greeted them without surprise, for the profession learns stories quickly and stores them like lamps. He examined the creature patiently, speaking in the soft technicalities of caring that felt to Zara like an unfamiliar poem. The animal was thin, its ribs faint beneath fur, and it carried a ring of healed scars that told of narrow escapes. The vet palmed its head, and were it not for the quickness of his eyes, she might have thought him indulgent. "A sweetheart," he said, and in the phrase Zara felt both relief and a new kind humiliation, that the thing could be called sweet while she had lived without such names in her house. He scanned for a chip. Machines are coarser judges than neighbors, and the scan made a small electronic sound like a hummingbird's wing. The screen gave a little spark of numbers. A registration appeared. Dr. Hamid's eyebrows rose, not in astonishment, but in the business-like recognition of facts interfering with comfort. He read the registration number aloud as if it were an account balance. There, a name, and an address that belonged not to anyone in the lane, but to a narrow green street beyond the river, to an area where the homes kept servants and gardens beyond the imagination of their own pavements. "The owner," said the doctor, "is registered in the city records. Private household." The phrase carried for Zara a weight that had not been in the room a minute before. Ownership makes strange the thing you have loved in secret. The idea that the small creature had a name on a ledger gave rise to a dozen new questions, as if names were locks and the ledger had the key. Who draws the line between stray and possession? Why was this creature on her step? The vet spoke of protocol. He would, by law, call the number and inform the registrant that their animal had been found. He would not, he said, seize an animal without paperwork. He asked her gently whether she wished to claim it in the interim. Zara, feeling the newness of heart like a heat from a small coal, nodded. The vet gave her a sheet and some instructions on basic care, and his hand on her shoulder was an old country thing. Not pity, precisely, but recognition that one who keeps a thing has a responsibility heavy as a roof. On her way home she thought of the geranium again, and of the little tendril which had begun to courage. To have a ledger sing the cat to another hand felt like a test posed by fate. Will she, who had answered a small voice because it asked, now stand down when the world demanded papers? Her thought was not moral in the highway. It was practical. She would, she determined, learn the name on that record. The ledger would not decide her heart. The phone at the clinic rang late that afternoon. The vet's voice, when he told her, was careful. The registrant had been informed. They asked for a photograph, which Dr. Hamid supplied. A man answered. He was brisk and sounded used to being obeyed. He asked for a meeting and gave a time that same evening. "I'll come personally," he said. "It is my cat." The phrase was precise, and the word personally sat in Zara's chest like a small stone. She noticed for the first time that the cat had settled into a slow, companionable pace about the house. It watched her as if she were learning a new language. It brought to her small things at odd hours, a curl of torn cloth from somewhere, a small coin, a feather. She would find these offerings on the hearth and blew into her heart like a child's trivial gift. She kept them in the teacup she used for keys. Each item was a riddle. Where had it come from and who had touched it before? Word spread in the lane. Men at the tea stall took bets on whether Zara would keep the creature. Mrs. Khan watched and then, one evening, dropped a plate with a flatbread on the step, pretending it was for a sale. The boy in the grocer's stand winked at the cat and, with the new civility of those who have seen a stubborn heart be stubborn well, set aside scraps with a flourish. But Mr. Bashir, who kept his palms clean of everything but the number of his days, plotted in a different register. He rang the municipal office and muttered words someone should have kept private, that Zara had been seen harboring strays and that there should be, by law, action. When the man who said, "I'll come personally," arrived that evening, he did not step from a rickshaw or a cab. He stepped from a car whose paint carried the faint smear of a life to which money had given license. He was neatly dressed, shoes with a shine that suggested hands who kept them polished, and he carried a bag as if it were the accoutrement of ownership. He spoke with a voice that had been given practice in making decisions for others. "Good evening," he said to Zara, with a politeness that fitted like a glove. He held out a photograph on which the creature looked more pampered than in its present state. The photograph's edges were glossy. In the picture, the cat reclined on silk. "That's my cat," he said simply. "Name's Assad." He pronounced the name with the same casual certainty that the ledger had when Dr. Hamid read it. Assad. Zara felt, oddly, as if she had been spoken to in a language she had once understood and since forgotten. The cat lifted its head and made no sign of recognition that matched the photograph. Animals remember by scent and habit more than by faces in paper, and this small non-recognition put a strange pressure on the moment. The man, Assad's owner, was not cruel. He claimed his rights, citing the registry and the law. He spoke of theft with a dignity that suspected everyone of being forgetful. It is easy to speak of theft when you have never been poor enough to name what you have lost as hunger or despair. His proposal was curt. He would take his cat and leave. He offered money to the woman as though to purchase forgiveness for an offense she had not meant to commit. Zara saw the offer and felt the blood retreat from her face like water. She did not give an answer then. She found that her voice would not, in the presence of possession, say what her heart said. Instead, she watched the cat, who rose and walked between her ankles, and with the simple grace of its movements asked, as animals do ask, that its fate be decided by touch rather than by signature. Zara saw how the creature trusted small things more than ledgers. The man, seeing only his photograph and his right, grew impatient. "He is a pedigree animal," he said, as if pedigree were a language that absolved impatience. "Valued. I cannot have him in the lanes." He unfolded an envelope and began to speak of the law. Zara, who had once kept every small ritual with the diligence of a monk, surprised herself by refusing. It was not heroism, it was the quiet of someone who had been given back a small capacity for sorrow that could be softened by being held. "He stayed," she said, voice low as a bell. He came and stayed. She saw then the absurdity of framing care as theft. The world turns virtues into crimes when it must. The man grew angry with the sort of anger that is practiced in boardrooms and not in lanes. He said he would return with papers. He would send someone to take the animal. He would call the municipal officers. "You must understand my position," he said, as if civilities could translate obligations into kindnesses. "Word, once made public, will travel like smoke in dry wood." The municipal office took note. Mr. Bashir, emboldened by the promise of written authority, called neighbors into his little conclave, and gathered signatures on a paper whose premise was that no person should keep animals in a built lane without proper registration. The dispute took on the shape of a ledger entry, rights asserted, countersigned, no one yet knowing how much soft resistance a woman with a shawl could muster. In the middle of these things, the ledger calls and the signatures, the cat showed another odd behavior. It refused to climb into the car when the man offered the box that all owners thought polite. Instead, it leapt lightly onto Zara's shoulder and sat there for a long time as if to mark its choice. The action unsettled the man, who liked things that marched to ledgers. It settled into Zara as a great and small proof. How odd, she thought, that ownership of heart should be decided by a small warm weight on a shoulder, rather than by a printed document. It was at this slow increase of trouble that Zara's old neighbor, Auntie Salima, a woman with knobby hands who had loved and been left, came to the house bearing a thermos and the blunt clarity of someone who keeps her own counsel. She offered few words. What she offered were acts. She took the cat and fed it the first milk it had known since perhaps youth, stroked along the whiskers in a way that said, "I name this thing cared for." "We cannot let them take it without cause," she said. And though she was not a lawyer, she spoke as if law were a fabric that sometimes needed mending by hand. The animal, which had by now learned the map of Zara's rooms, learned also to sleep by Auntie Salima when Zara was away buying a simple bowl. It turned out that in these neighbors there were not only enemies. There were pockets of secret kindness that had been waiting like seeds in winter for an occasion to sprout. That moral geography is how communities are often saved, not by declaration, but by minor rebellions of care. Halfway through this rising tide, when the signatures on Mr. Bashir's petition were enough to make a clerk look, and sometimes enough to make an inspector think of a day's work, Zara paused to ask herself questions she had avoided like cold rooms. Have you ever had an animal wait for you when you didn't ask them to? Do you believe cats know when we're at our lowest? She asked herself these questions not to make a sermon, but to find the reason for her own stubbornness. The answers, when they rose, were not neat. The cat had come with a small claim on courage, and in answering it she had also answered a loneliness that had begun to feel like the only permanent thing she owned. To return the animal because a ledger said so would be to let caution win its old victory. To keep it might invite trouble that had its own costs. Each answer was a rope pulling her either toward the public square or back to the small circle of her hearth. The man named Asad returned 2 days later with papers. They were clean and precise as a gentleman's letter. The municipal man who came with him wore a badge, and his expression the trained neutrality of bureaucrats who prefer forms to arguments. "We have received a complaint," he stated, the way a bell states a subtle fact. "We will inspect." He spoke politely, but with the sense of a thing already decided. Zara refused to open the door at once. She stood, for perhaps the first time since the day she learned to make her grief invisible, in the doorway that divides what one has allowed to enter from what one keeps outside. Going inside the house would make a private action public. It would draw the lane like a net. She could feel the plant at the window, the little green plant that had budded as if in answer to the cat's watch. And she thought of how small growth can be a dangerous thing if the wind of opinion changes course. "Please," said Auntie Salima quietly, "let's show them he is well cared for. Show them the proof." They opened the door to the gentleman's inspection. The animal, who had been asleep with ease, woke and flew like a small shadow between legs, its soft body offering itself again to those gentle hands. The municipal man took notes with professional restraint. He raised no voice. He looked at the cat and then at Zara, who felt under his glance the weight of a public ledger ready to be turned. Then came the turning point. That small, decisive motion which, once performed, makes walking back a different route entirely. The municipal man paused and said, "He is chipped. The registry shows his owner is a person who insists on reclaiming him." He looked at Zara with a balance of duty and distance. "We must take statements. If the owner signs a claim, the law has its procedures." Zara felt something inside her yield and yet harden into a new ore. The decision to keep had been made by warmth and small weight on a shoulder. Now there were papers and the breath of men who keep order. To give him up would be to hand over the small bright thread that had stitched a patch onto the empty part of her life. To keep him in defiance of the paper would be to become a kind of outlaw in a lane where she had always been careful to live within small rules. She chose not to make a spectacle. Instead, she did something quieter and more absolute. She told the municipal man that if they needed time to arrange the formalities, she would keep the animal under her care. She wrote down her own simple information. She signed with a hand that trembled but did not break. It was a small paper in the ledger of the city, but it was a signature. The man left with his badge and the paper that said the situation would be watched. The gentleman drove away in his polished car, his expression intact as if the world had not altered. Yet the world had altered. Once you put yourself in opposition to a ledger, the ledger looks for corroborations. Mr. Bashir collected more signatures and sent them to the office. The gentleman's owner made a show of civility and then made a statement about values in the neighborhood posted briefly on the social network for the district. The municipal man, who had at first nodded as if this were a small thing, now called once more and said, "We have been asked to come at night, for the animal's safety and to ensure no one is harmed." That message lodged under Zara's ribs like a dark spark. Night actions are always heavier than day ones. They carry with them the sense that the world is drawing a curtain for reasons it does not explain. She prepared for the possibility with the quiet practices that had kept her life: additional bowls, a small lock on the back door, a lamp. The cat, who seemed to know more about small dangers than many men credited them with, wound itself about her ankles as if to say, "I will be here." On the night the men came, voices were muffled under the streetlights. Drums of steps moved in the lane and left shadows like hands on the walls. Zara stood at the window and listened. A knock sounded at the door. Not the polite paperwork insistence of earlier, but the heavy, business-like pounding of someone who comes prepared. She opened slightly, enough to place herself between entrance and refusal. Two men stood there, not the municipal clerk, but others. Plainclothes, one with the sort of watch that commands attention, another whose jacket smelled faintly of oil and authority. They flashed a card too quickly. Their faces were set in ways that could not be read as neighborly. "We have orders," said the man with the watch, and his voice had the crispness of a door being closed somewhere else. "To take the animal." Zara felt the moment fold. The cat, sensing the tension that had the gravity of storms, leapt from the low perch and hid under the chair. A small, breathing thing folded into shadow. The men pushed their weight forward as if to make the house give up its secret. "Open," they said. "We have the owner's authorization." Zara did not open. She wrapped the shawl tighter and held the chair against the flap of the door as if using an arm to hold back not only men, but the tide of anything that would take what had been given to her for no reason but choice. In the hall, the plant on the sill stood like an accused thing. Its leaves trembled as if the air itself were asking them to choose. There was a silence that came after their demand, long enough for a memory to appear. It was the memory of a man's laugh, of a photograph folded and kept in a drawer. It was the memory of evenings where 2 cups had been set at the table, and one remained empty. It was the small history that sits like a book on the shelf, quiet until the hand reaches for it. In that silence, a voice from outside the lane said in a tone that made the air feel colder, "You do not understand. This is not your affair. We are authorized." And with that claim, the night folded like a card, and a new danger stood at the threshold of Zara's quiet life. The cat's small cry, half question and half plea, trembled in the room as if to ask who would answer now. The door between refusal and surrender held a shape of finality that would make the next hour a moment from which there could be no easy returning. Who stood at the other side of the threshold, and for what ledger did they claim this small warmth? The sound of footsteps outside the gate was the only answer the lane could give before the next turning of fate. The night that bent toward decision wore a cold, woolen sky. Lamps made small islands in the lane, and the world between them lay dark as thought. The men with the authoritative air had left the first time and returned with the weight that men who believe in form learn to bear. That form will solve what feeling cannot. Zara had never been a woman of grand gestures. She had been a woman of patient adjustments, of arranging the small certainties of days. Yet there is a moment when the smallness itself demands a sternness it had long kept secret. That night the lane was a thing held by 2 breaths, one of law and ledger, the other of a shawl-warmed promise. Inside the house, the cat lay curled in the hollow of a chair, as if all the world were a long asleep thing, and the only office was to keep vigil. Its breathing was a metronome that counted Zara's heart. The geranium sent out a faint green thread in the window. The plant had become a witness to the days, not merely a token. Auntie Salima sat in a chair by the hearth with hands folded like a prayer and a thermos between her knees. Dr. Hamid, summoned and certain that the laws of cities are usually dull things, paced with a face that had learned to be practical and grave. Outside the lane gathered its small chorus. Those who stood for the law, those who loved order for its own sake, those who appreciated comfort and counting, but there were others too. The grocer with his small pile of kindness, the boy who once flung pebbles and now stood uncomfortable and ashamed at the edge, the baker's wife who walked up and down as if to displace the stillness with motion. They had not come because they all loved Zara. They had come because a single act had been made public, as all small acts that refuse conformity eventually become. The lane had become unwillingly an arena. The man in the polished shoes and the owner named Assad in the paper, who carried the certainty of entitlement like a badge, arrived with his ledger and his impatience. He wore civility like armor. "I will take my property," he said. His voice had an evenness that counted as proof of right. He had brought a man from the municipal office, and behind them were two others who were not in municipal dress but who carried the sense of men accustomed to settling things. Zara opened the door a little and kept her body between the threshold and the street as if the house itself were a membrane that knew how to keep life from bruising. The cat rose and, as animals will do who have elected a place, walked up to her ankles and rubbed as if to say, "Choose." The man with the polished shoes lingered a foot beyond the lamplight and produced the papers he had kept ready. He slipped them from an envelope with the care of someone who keeps his affairs tidy. He read them aloud as if the sound itself were a law that could not be argued with. "The chip is registered to me," he said. "We have a claim." He looked at the municipal man with the kind of authority that becomes quickness. "I have the right to remove him." Zara felt something within her break small and clear. The choice for a stray is usually between two boxes. Return to those who keep you with names and pedigree, or remain where someone chose to answer. Here was the moment that would teach which box would be the better teacher. She could have offered compromise, a truce of sorts. Instead, she did something that surprised her own hands. She took the cat to her chest, wrapped it in the shawl she had first used to rescue it from the stones, and held it as if the small animal's life were a lit candle whose flame could be put out by sudden winds. "I found him," she said, and the sound of her voice in the open lane was the sound of a bell struck inside itself. "He was on my step. He is here." It was not a statement of law but of fact. The city man said nothing. "He is a clerk by temperament and preferred forms." Forms had to be filled. The owner hissed, hot in private entitlement. "You cannot keep him. You are not the registered guardian." "Do I have to be registered to be kind?" Zara asked. It was not a legal argument, but a question shaped as a lance. The man's jaw worked. He reached for the paper again, the ledger which in his eyes was the world in miniature. Then the cat did something that no paper could anticipate. It lifted itself sharply from her arms and leapt, not toward the man's hand as the polished shoes expected, but up into the man's arms with a quickness that made everyone gasp. For a heartbeat there was a stillness so absolute it became a new kind of silence. A silence that required attention. The man had no small tenderness in him. He caught the cat in the fold of his suit with an arm that did not understand how to hold softness. If the cat had been calculating, it gave no sign. Animals do not perform for ledgers. They act for taste and habit and perhaps for a memory of hold. The cat's paw touched the man's chest and a small, precise sound emerged. Not a purr, but a two-note cry like the press of a secret. The man smiled in the way men used to smile in photographs. The smile of owners who see themselves confirmed by possession. He took a step forward as if now guarded by right, as if the act of the cat's acceptance were a stamp of legitimacy. At that very instant the cat shifted its weight and dug a small, furious claw into the man's sleeve, and then, as if unwilling to make the act cruel, it sprang from his arms and leapt into Zara's lap again, as if to say the choice was not made by the first test of warm hands. The man staggered a little and swore under his breath. His civility had been punctured by a thing he had presumed to own. The municipal man stepped forward with the diplomacy of someone who must now act. "We must follow procedure," he said. Zara listened to the words and felt their flatness like a smoke in the throat. This was the place where forms displaced the geometry of a heart. In the room behind her, the geranium's leaf trembled like a small witness. The cat curled now as if to keep its own counsel, looked at her with eyes that did not belong entirely to a beast. They held a question and, by answering, had already made a choice. Then the neighbor, Mr. Bashir, who had been their antagonist in the early days, surprised those who had kept him judged. He stepped forward and said, in a tone that tried for authority and landed in a neighborly register, "This is not about paper. It's about the rules for the lane." He read from a thin notebook the words he had prepared, signed names and municipal code, as if the law had been sharpened into a spear. He thought perhaps to finish what he had begun. That was when Auntie Salima moved in a motion no one had expected. She rose slowly and planted herself between the men and Zara. Her hands, knotted, worn, honest, or a kind of weather those men could not account for. He lives here now, she said simply with the authority of someone who had loved and been left and learned the measure of small things. You cannot take him in the dark and say the law will make him better. The law is a cloth for windows. It lets the cold in sometimes. Her voice carried the sound of a woman who had seen too many small comforts blown away by men with ledgers. The municipal man, who preferred forms and not disputes, looked at his colleagues. The owner in the polished shoes felt affronted not by law but by the publicness of his attempt. We will return with the correct forms, he said, as if retreating into bureaucracy were an honorable exit. Rest assured. But Knight had a certain appetite for decisive acts. The owner, who owned not only a ledger but a circle of friends who liked order, had brought men who thought themselves authorized. They did not plan to bow away easily. One of them, a burly man from behind the polished shoes, made a step forward as if to reach an arm in. Zara felt the movement like an old ache. She lifted the shawl and wrapped it about the cat's head as if to make of the small body a secret. Take me, she thought, with a sudden clarity that is the grace of danger. If law would take this small comfort, then she would make the act of surrender into a confession. She would confess that the thing she had done was to reclaim herself. She would not beg the man. She would choose what she must do. Then she did the thing that shocked everyone as much by its gentleness as by its audacity. She took the cat in both hands, wrapped it to her like a child, and walked forward until the wooden step met her shoes and the lamplight broke over her face. There is a peculiar weight to steps made toward those who will seize what you love. They are steps that must be counted like beads. She placed herself flat before the men, an act of humility and of stubbornness, and spoke to the man with the polished shoes as if he were a man and not a ledger. You have your papers, she said in a voice that did not tremble now. You have your rights written in ink. I have a right too, to refuse to give my hand's warmth away. She laid the shawl on the ground between them like an offering, and then, in a motion both small and complete, she removed the necklace that had long hung at her throat, a simple loop of old silver that had been in her family. She held it out to the owner. You may take this, she said. Take this coin of my life. I am poor in wealth. I am not poor in holding. You may take it if you will trade it for the cat. The man recoiled at the suggestion as if offered a surprise not in his ledger. What is this? He snapped. He saw the small value of the silver and mistook its insubstantiality for need. He was used to buying things, to choosing them off a list. To him, the necklace was currency and the cat a commodity. He thought to replace the transaction with money and be done. No money, said Zara sharply, and now words hardened into will. You may take what I have. I will not sell him for coin. If you want him, you may take him and let me see him sometimes. Let me know where he goes. Let him be more than a name on a register. There was a pause. The owner, who dealt in transaction, was unsettled by a request that required a human promise. A meeting arrangement? He asked. Visits? This is not typical. Then take the coin and the visits and make them typical for him, Zara said. If he is to be your property, then own also the duty that comes with it. If you refuse, then let it be known in the lane that the man who keeps him keeps only the cat's comfort and not its heart. It was in that bargain, a strange, human trade, that the true character of those present had its trial. Some men will rather have the paper and keep their conscience light. Others will take the errand of kindness because it makes their ledger messy. The owner, whose life had carved him into the shape of contracts, thought of the paper. He thought also of the publicness of the lane, and the gossip that would follow if he insisted on taking the animal by force. He glanced at the municipal man, hoping procedure would be a good shield. The municipal man shrugged, as bureaucrats do when duty grows complicated with witness. We will have to bring this to the office, he said. That is the only way. The moment had arrived that might have resolved itself into a compromise. But life is not always merciful in middle places. Mr. Bashir, whose grievance had long been sharpened into a weapon by fear of disorder, stepped forward and produced another paper, not a municipal form but a short petition signed by those who had feared strays would bring vermin and disease. He thrust it into the municipal man's hand like a challenge. This proves nuisance, he said. You must act. Now the night grew heavy with the sense that paper could be made into a blade. The municipal man, obliged to obey both forms and the weight of men who sign forms, spoke the phrase that in that city night is sometimes the last note. We have a complaint. We must act to remove animals that cause distress. He looked to the owner as if to gain authorization. The owner, who had until now only thought in tidy contracts, thought quickly. In his mind he could vision adherence to procedure that would keep him clear and keep the animal in his possession, while the lane would be quiet again. He nodded. The municipal man's watch ticked with the business of evenings that have turned into enforcement. Auntie Salima moved before the men could act. She stepped so that her short height was between the municipal man's stride and the door. She lifted a palm and said in a voice that had the softness of an old prayer, "If you take this creature from here tonight, you will take something that made a woman breathe again. You will take more than a cat." Her voice was not melodrama. It was the kind of moral sight that cannot be docketed on paper. Someone near the lamplight, a boy who had played at cruelty and learned shame, now stepped forward and placed himself at Zara's back. Others followed. The baker's wife put her hand over her mouth as if to stop the sound of fear, but in doing so made more noise than she meant to. In that surge, the lane arranged itself into a human wall whose law was not the city's but something older and more difficult to count, the law of neighbors. The municipal man, whose job had never intended to be moral philosopher, calculated the path of least trouble. He could file paperwork and have the owner come back in the morning. He could put the matter into the slow, noisy machine of the office and let it grind. He chose, with the stoic indifference of his role, to step back and say they would postpone the action until daylight. The owner, frustrated and not willing to be laughed at in his own ledger, cursed under his breath and left in a drive of indignation, promising recourse. At that moment, when the lane seemed to breathe again because the immediate momentum of force had stalled, Asad the cat leapt up into Zara's lap and put his small head into the crook of her elbow as if to test the measure of the world. Zara, who had held the animal as if it were the fragile proof of her own renewed capacity to bear love, let the breath leave her like a prayer. It should have been then. A small ending, a night postponed and a cat that stayed. But climaxes are tricky. They have the habit of asking more of those who have answered the call. As the man with the polished shoes drove off, a different sound sliced across the lane. A whistle, long and thin, the sound of an omen that the neighborhood recognized because it had been used before in a story no one wanted to believe. That whistle was the call of another vehicle, a government van with tinted windows, and from it stepped men whose faces were set like stone and whose badges were not of municipal paperwork but of a more final sort. The men moved with an authority that did not consult signature books. They produced papers in a quick, sealed manner. An order, stamped by a department that handles claims of property where ownership is contested and where, in some cases, private claims are settled by force. The burly man who had attempted to reach inside earlier opened his mouth as if to protest. "We are acting under a warrant," said the man with the thin voice. "We have authorization to retrieve property where there is an allegation of removal." His words were precise, metallic. The lane tightened like a rope. Zara felt her chest go thin. The thing she had cradled all night now sat shuddering in her lap, as if it could feel the ledger as needle and thread. The cat arched its back and looked with eyes wide as moons at the men whose business it had somehow entered. People in the lane moved like a flock that senses thunder approaching, some to shelter, some to stand. Auntie Salima advanced again, with a fist clenched not in anger but in the steadiness of someone who will not stand aside when a small thing is about to be taken. The man with the thin voice read the sealed paper aloud. It was an order of retrieval signed with an authority that, in its words, made Zara a trespasser. Where an animal is alleged to have been removed from registered owner, officers may retrieve said property for return. The clause made the room seem narrower. There is a peculiar cruelty in clauses that make hearts into things and then give the power to remove them. There, at the pressure point where law and living meet, Zara had to decide. She could hand the cat over and retreat into the safety of her rooms in the shape of a life that does not ask for trouble. Or she could stand against men whose paper was backed by a force that sometimes moves without mercy. She saw the geranium in the window and thought of its new tendril reaching like a question. She thought of the photograph folded in her drawer and felt the weight of the name she loved. She felt also the small thing clasped in the cat's offering cup, a coin and tiny feather, the riddle of where he roamed. She understood utterly that this was the climax and not a point of melodrama but of unadorned decision. The exactness of the moment snapped like a twig. Time seemed to narrow into a point the size of breath. She raised the shawl and placed it over the cat's back like a small flag of claim. She stepped in front of the men so her body would be the line that forms cannot cross without consequence. "You will take me first," she said, and the words were a thunder in the lane. "If you must take him, take me first." "Take my name then. But to take him without my consent will make the air of this lane a place without mercy." The thin-voiced man measured her. In his face was the habit of calculation. To take a woman in the night over the custody of a small cat would require more than a sealed paper. It would require a spectacle. The burly man behind him made a movement as if to produce a method of persuasion, and a hand reached for the cat. At that instant, and here is the thing that makes climax a thing remembered, the cat made the only decision left to it. It leapt from Zara's lap, not toward the men but into the darkness that lay under the lamplight in the narrow passage between two houses. For a second the animal vanished like a thought sent into shadow. Every head turned. The thin-voiced man swore and the burly hand struck the air. The cat's silhouette flashed at the base of the wall and then sprang, with all the agility of a living arrow, up onto the small ledge of the neighbor's stoop and then into a low drain, and thence into the small secret of the lane. For one breath, the lane became a thing, holding its own circumstantial miracle. The cat had chosen a different kind of answer than captivity. It had fled into the communal dark, a sign that it would not be made into the merchandise of paper. The men with their orders shouted and moved, but the lane had rearranged itself. Neighbors peered from doors. Voices rose, and the municipal man, now the broker of procedure, found his clerical certainties made complicated by public witness. Zara stood where she had been, panting slightly, shawl fallen from her shoulders, hands open and empty, as if in the act of abandonment she had refused to surrender everything. The cat's leap had been a small honed violence. It had not fled because it was wild. It had fled because it would not be chosen by a ledger over a life. Its disappearance into the dark was a choice that made anyone who had loved it, or who had been loved by it, complicit in its fate. The men looked at one another, then at the house, then at the lane. The thin-voiced man, who had come with what he thought was finality, now felt the publicness of the lane as a pressure that would require further orders. He gave the order to search and left a notice to return with a further warrant. The owner, humiliated in the way that only those who count things can be humiliated by the refusal of a small creature, walked off in a kind of cold fury. The lane, in the minutes that followed, became something like a field after thunder. People made small movements to one another, offering blankets, murmuring reassurances, trying to stitch back a night that had been strained. Zara did not move. She went to the window and watched the little dark drain under the neighbor's step as if the cat might reappear, in the way a name reappears in a memory. Auntie Selima touched her arm and said softly, "You did right. It was not final." The cat had chosen the darkness rather than the ledger, and by so choosing had refused to be the instrument of someone's calculated civility. Yet choice carries as much danger as it does dignity. In the morning there would be forms filed and calls placed. There would be the lure of legal power and the thin instruments of municipal life. For now, in the half-light, the lane felt like a knitted thing that had held a small defiance. As Zara stood, the hush of the house catching at her breath, she felt a truth like a small coin in her pocket. To hold something is to be held. She had been the hand that answered the small petition at the door, and by answering she had re-entered the world of claim and loss and risk. The climax had been reached not as drama alone, but as the unadorned decision to answer with presence. The consequence was uncertain. The moral was large and stubborn. Would she keep him? Would paper overrule breath? Would the animal who had refused both return of its own will? The night kept its last secret close. The men had gone and the lane became a place of waiting. Zara, who had learned to keep grief in small compartments, now had to wait in a different way, a way that placed her heart in the hands of not only law but possibility. She pressed her forehead to the glass of the window and saw her reflection ghosted with lamplight, and beneath it the small green tendril of the geranium like a question. Outside, somewhere beneath the thin fold of the lane, a small sound came. Not the precise purr of contentment, but the uncertain click of claws on brick, the tiny voice of a creature choosing its own path. Zara put her hand to the glass, and in the silence a single question stood up like a stone. Would you stay if you were in their place? Morning after the night that had split the lane like a seam opened, the world seemed smaller and larger at once. Smaller, because papers and men had retreated and the immediate threat had been postponed. Larger because the shape of neighborly life had altered. Lines had been drawn and erased in the same breath, and people who had not thought themselves brave had found themselves making small stands. Zara woke with a weight in her chest that was neither wholly fear nor wholly relief, but something braided of both. She rose as she had long learned to rise, with careful motions that preserve dignity and with hands that know how to measure loss. The cat had not returned by dawn. The house, for all its sudden traffic of concern the night before, now resumed the old rhythm of cups and shadows. Auntie Salima made porridge and set a saucer by the window where the geranium sat. Its tiny new tendril curled like a question. The plant looked less like a token than before. It was becoming an emblem. The small green thread that had once been a private promise was now something that could be pointed at in the street and recognized as progress. To Zara, the plant seemed to breathe a little more easily. They searched the lane and the neighbors' yards. They called his name softly, as if the voice could shape return. The baker placed scraps in corners. The grocer's boy, shame still on his cheeks, led a small trail of food along the walls, thinking the cat might follow the scent of kindness back. People who had been spectators became quiet searchers. Their eyes, previously set to a praise and a sign, softened into something else. The lane wore its ordinary light like a brow still damp after a storm. The municipal offices, however, do not forget quickly. Notices had been filed. The man in polished shoes had not taken his defeat gracefully, and his ledger would not be closed by mere public embarrassment. He had resources and time, and in his world such things count. He had left a message through channels that make resolution slow and procedural. He would file a formal claim the next morning, and legal officers would follow their forms. For Zara, this meant the fight was not over. The temptation to return to solitude, to fold this brave, brief turbulence away and reclaim the old quiet, tugged at her. Yet something in her had changed. The shawl in the back of her cupboard, once an ornament of private rituals, had learned the smell of another heart. She could not return to a life that had so recently hinted at warmth. The very fact of having chosen a small risk had made a new kind of duty. They found tracks, small deft paw prints that led from the drain where the cat had fled, along the low wall to an alley of stacked crates behind the spice seller's shop. The alley had been a map of odors and sleeping things, a place where the city's small creatures keep their counsel. There, curled in the shadow of a discarded shawl and with a belly flat from too many nights of hunger, lay the cat. He looked up with the tired dignity of someone who has chosen freedom, and then wondered whether freedom would feed him. Zara knelt and found the animal thin and shaking but determined. It permitted her hand and made no show of gratitude. He had acted, and now he would live with the consequence of his choice. He bore a new scratch along his flank, a thin red seam that had not been there before, the sort of living mark that speaks of narrow escapes. In his jaw, a small swelling, a tender place where perhaps a contest had left its signature, made him wince when he took food. Zara's hands trembled not with fear but with a knowledge of what mending requires. She wrapped him in the shawl and carried him home, each step a stitch toward an altered life. Word reached the municipal office that the animal had been seen and that a neighbor had been found to have harbored him. The official who had earlier chosen to postpone action now had a thicker file. The man in polished shoes, stoic in his certainty, reappeared with a solicitor's slip and a gentleman's determination. He came that morning not to arrest but to bargain, for the lane had turned witness and the ledger had to be rearranged to fit the new witness. It was in that bargaining that the geranium's small prophecy came home. The plant had unfurled another leaf. The green tendril had at last offered a small blossom, nothing showy, but enough color to look like a response. When Zara placed the cat on the sill to feel the light, the animal brushed the tiny leaves as if to bless the plant for having kept faith. The cat's attention to the geranium was not a fanciful thing. It had from the first sat by the pot and watched. The plant had been a promise, and the animal's touch seemed to fill that promise like rain into a cup. In small ways, the world was paying back the risk. Negotiations, when they come as they do in life, are rarely clean. The owner proposed that he would retract his claim if Zara signed a formal arrangement, allowing him to visit on weekends and if she agreed to keep the cat's medical records in a jointly accessible file. The man styled it as a co-parenting agreement for an animal, which had the absurdity of modern life written all over it. He wanted proof of care, photographs, and guarantees that the animal would not be kept in the lane where he suspected disease might grow. He insisted, too, on replacement of his initial discomfort with a ceremony. The cat would be vaccinated by a vet he chose. He would pay the vet, and in exchange he would accept visits. Zara heard the phrases and felt their small arithmetic. Visits for a life. A ledger proposed in which love is rationed into appointments. There was a hunger in her for ease. A simple acceptance would save her the trouble of forms, but she also understood something the man in polished shoes perhaps did not. Animals do not always fit into timesheets, and the cost of measuring care with currency is a thing that kills tenderness slowly. She wanted the cat's life to sit in the world like a leaf in the sun, not like an entry on a page. The choice bent toward what had already been lived. She allowed the owner a measure of access, a single Sunday a month because the man insisted on routine. But she refused to make the animal into a thing that would be ferried like an indentured heir. If he goes, she said plainly, it is because he goes of his own accord, not because a paper says so. She signed the minimal forms needed for the municipal office to close the case for the present. The owner, who had sought only to enforce rights, accepted with the hesitance of someone who must submit a ledger to public eyes. There was another movement, less formal and more telling. The owner, when he had seen the cat curled in the shawl, had not at first understood the depth of the claim that warmth had made upon the small animal. He watched as Zara tended the scratches with a careful hand, and as Auntie Salima massaged a paste of herbs into the wound with the gravity of an old medicine. He saw them feed the cat together with a tenderness his ledger did not teach him. Something like shame, or its neighbor, awareness, budded in him. He had always known the cat like a thing that swam in the background of his orderly life. He had not known until the night before that a cat could make a woman stand in front of a door and say, "You will take me first." That sight which had jolted him changed the calculus of his claim. In small human ways, the owner became less gloved. He asked where the cat had been hurt and listened when told. He offered to pay the vet fees as if expense could heal scrapes better than apology. He volunteered awkwardly to bring a better blanket. These were gestures that would make sense to a man who assigns goodness values in monetary terms. Yet they also contained a kernel of something more, a curiosity perhaps of what might be required of gentleness. He left that afternoon with a paper signed and with a promise that was not airtight, but was richer than any ledger could have required. The lane returned to a softer kind of attention. Neighbors who had once been quick to judge now paused to ask after the cat. The baker's wife brought fresh bread and a little bowl of milk. The grocer set aside fish bones from time to time. The boy who had swung the broom now crouched at Zara's step and asked in a voice smoothed by contrition whether he might play with the cat under supervision. These small reparations are the way communities stitch over their errors, not by public punishment but by tasks that ask the errant to do better. Zara, meanwhile, found herself stepping out of a long dormancy. She came to the market with a list again. She took to sweeping the stoop for neighbors who could not do it themselves, and to making sure the cat had fresh water by the sill. Her days filled, not with the heavy rituals of grief but with the lighter attentions of care. Where before she had been an island made of solemn habits, she now had cause to leave the house on small errands that allowed the cat to sun himself on the low wall. The simple fact of another living thing depending on her nudged her toward people in ways she had not expected. There was also a subtle change in how she saw herself. She had always thought of grief as a thing to be endured with the dignity of someone who keeps a household in order, but now she learned that grief could be softened by the act of giving. When she held the cat while the pain in its flank healed, she felt her own ache shrink by share. The cat, for all its cunning, gave back a quiet apprenticeship in intimacy. A small curriculum that taught her how to place a palm and not expect the past to disappear, but to make it companionable. In the days that followed, a curious exchange began between the owner and Zara. He would come on the appointed Sundays, not as a man bearing demands, but as someone who began to learn the grammar of kindness. He would sit in the lane under the lamp and watch the cat stretched across the sill, and sometimes he would say nothing for a long while. Once, when the cat leapt onto his knees without invitation, and then promptly onto Zara's lap, The owner laughed a small, surprised laugh. It was the sound of a man surprised at what he had not known he lacked. "You must forgive my manner," he said one afternoon, half apologetic, half embarrassed. "I have been busy." "Busy can be lonely," Zara said without malice. Her words were not condemnation. They had the plainness of someone who has sat through long dinners with silence. For a moment they sat in a companionable quiet, and the cat, approving of the silence, put his head down and slept. Auntie Salama declared the cat's return as a sort of village triumph and began to prepare little remedies, instructing Zara in compresses and the right herbs to simmer. Her fingers, which had felt like coarse tools in a world that required finer hands, now moved with the authority of someone who knows how life is mended. She said with the bluntness of a woman who has seen much, "An animal teaches you what your heart has room for. Mind it well." In this way, the Lane story smoothed into new patterns. The municipal man, though he had the files and the bureaucratic weight, found that the cost of pursuing every domestic discord was too high when weighed against public witness and the faint shame of calling a woman in the night. He filed away the case with a note. "Resolved for the present. Monitor." It is the language of offices, a way of making rest even when rest is not certain. But it was enough at the moment for the Lane to breathe. With the immediate conflict thus managed, other threads that had been set in motion now began to return for their due. The cat, who had been offering small tokens when the curl of cloth, the feather, the little coin that had once been a riddle, now brought older things. Under a crate in the spice alley they found a tiny tin charm with initials that matched. No ledger yet suggested another. Life. Dr. Hamid suggested that the creature had perhaps moved between worlds, the one of warm parlors and the one of alleys where survival teaches cunning. There is a particular dignity in animals who traverse both, because they are fluent in the languages of both kindness and caution. Zara, who kept the little tin charm in the cup with the coin and feathers, found herself thinking not of ownership but of belonging. The cat had not been a possession to be catalogued. It had been a presence that chose, and the choice had changed everything. Her house, which had been a museum of quiet grief, became instead a room of small recoveries. In the evenings she sat by the window and watched the cat sit on the sill and rub against the geranium as if to say thank you to the plant that had been a sign. One afternoon, as a compact piece settled into the lane like dust into the crooks of a floor, Zara paused, as if remembering something she had nearly lost. She reached into a drawer and found the folded photograph of a man's hands, the one she had kept for years. She opened it and looked at the hands that had once set a cup at the other side of the table. At the era's edge, she felt the smallness of remembrance and the largeness of present warmth. She went to the window and placed the photograph against the glass, not for the cat but for herself, and then returned to the cat's side. The bracing thing about sorrow is that it gives you the chance to love in small measures. And perhaps those measures are the only ones that will keep hearts from shattering again. When neighbors asked if she felt the old wound lessen, she would not claim healing as if it were already finished. She felt rather the wound turned into a map, a place you know and check regularly. The cat was not a cure. It was a companion in the long work of living. It had not rewritten her past, but had made it possible to write new lines. There remained, of course, the man with the polished shoes, whose ledger had not entirely closed. He would call and inquire, not with the earlier coldness but with a softened curiosity that bore the seeds of reconsideration. He visited less frequently for the sake of claiming and more frequently for the sake of presence, and the change in him, while not dramatic, made the lane a little gentler. The municipal office, when pressed, admitted in bureaucratic language that sometimes human arguments do not fit neatly into forms. Thus, the thread of authority that had threatened to tear the night's fabric apart was rerouted into the quiet of signed promises, and the geranium, that solitarily tended plant, flowered in earnest. Its small blossom was not a miracle in the sense of thunder, but a quiet miracle, proof that small things, tended with intent, will respond. The cat rubbed the stem every morning as if to remind it of its own resilience. The plant, in turn, was proof of the house's newly opened doors. Windows of possibility. Has an animal ever changed your life in a way you didn't expect? This question is not meant only for the lane. It is a simple key for whoever listens. For Zara, the answer moved like a soft current. The cat had taught her how to step forward when the world asked for courage thinly, and how to accept the mess of living that comes with opening one's heart. The change was not a settled thing, but a continuing one, an education by small accidents and gentle persistence. As the days lengthened into a rhythm of small tasks, the lane found its new equilibrium. Children chased one another in the afternoons while the cat lounged on the low wall. The baker's wife kept an eye out for extra scraps. The boy who once threw stones now practiced smoothing the path for the cat to cross without danger. The municipal man put his folder away with an entry that closed in the present, but left open the possibility of return. The owner and Zara, through their tentative meetings and shared care, learned that stewardship is sometimes a joint thing. Zara's transformation was not a sudden blooming, but a slow accretion. She found that she had new stories to tell, not of loss as a finality, but as a thing that could be made into company. She would speak with Auntie Salima at her side about herbs and about how animals know the weather of sorrow. She would listen when others told their small griefs and offer the kind of advice that has the scent of tea and the slow hum of patience. The falling action, that unglamorous, necessary part of the tale, had done its work. It had gathered the consequences of the climax and arranged them so the scene could move toward a closing that felt earned. There were scars and legal threads, and a man who must learn to be less certain of his rights and more attentive to the duties those rights implied. There was also, in the quiet corners, a small animal who chose whom it loved, and a woman who learned that choosing to be seen is itself a kind of salvation. The days would continue to make their demands. Some bills would arrive, some letters would be posted, and some nights would be quiet with the ache that had not left entirely. But the most important thing had occurred. Someone had answered a waiting. From the drain to the sill, from the shawl to the tender herb compresses, the arc of the lane's small life had bent toward humaneness. And in the warm light of a late afternoon, when the sun slipped between the buildings and painted the geraniums leaf gold, the cat leapt lightly onto the sill, pressed its head against Zara's palm, and then, with a quiet flourish, settled its chin against the small silver charm in the teacup, the tiny tin that had been found under the spice crates, as if to say, in the only language it knew, that some things returned to the place that fed them. The plant's little blossom shook in the breeze and left a gentle dusting on the windowsill. In that quiet flourish, the falling action came to its close, leaving enough questions to be asked but fewer dangers to be feared. The lane exhaled. The life within the house, which had once moved like a museum piece, now walked with a small and sturdy step. The winter that followed the small storm of that lane was not a winter of drama. It was a winter of softened routines and little translations, people learning the grammar of being neighborly again, and the house learning a new measure of life in the sound of a cat's breathing at night. Resolution, as any careful person knows, is less a single curtain call than an accumulation of small acts that settle like clean cloth into a wardrobe. What had begun as a petition at a back door, a tiny patient asking to be held, ended not with grand pronouncements but with the steady, honest business of living together. In the weeks that followed the climbing and the falling and the choices made in the lane's lamplight, the world around Zara settled into new, softer shapes. The municipal files were marked monitor, a phrase that contained resignation and convenience in equal measure. The man with polished shoes, not wicked and not kindly, merely uncomplicated by the deeper habits of listening, came more often at times with a paper, more often with an awkward kindness he had not previously known how to name. He learned in that slow fashion of the unimaginative who are forced by circumstance to expand, to sit without speaking too much, and to watch the cat sleep in the pool of sunlight on the sill. The cat, for his part, allowed him these visits as one allows rain, useful in some measure, but not something one expects in the shape of devotion. Zara's days smoothed from the ragged edge of grief into a pattern threaded with the small tasks that bind communities, sweeping the step in the morning, lending an ear to a neighbor's misgivings about a sick parrot 2 doors down, trading little jars of preserved lemons for a bowl of warmed milk. She learned that attention, given continually, becomes a currency. It buys back small joys and pays off in the currency of less lonely evenings. She also learned, with a humility befitting a life remade slowly, that courage is often a series of small refusals to let fear define you. A woman who chooses to bend and feed where habit had taught her to shut the door. The geranium, which had been nothing more than a private charm on the sill, turned out to be a more honest seer than any rumor of the neighborhood. Its leaves continued to broaden, and the little blossom it had offered in the weeks of contention opened into something that smelled like the memory of summer rain. The cat would sit as if on contract and nudge its head against the green stalk each morning. Zara would watch this and feel in the plant an emblem, not a portent but an evidence, that small tendings produce small miracles. The plant's growth a quiet repayment for the shawl that had been wrapped about a cold body, the tin charm found beneath the spice crates, and the coin and the feather that collected in Zara's teacup like tokens on a tabletop of memory, became a shrine of sorts, not holy in the dramatic way of pulpit and pew, but holy in the old-fashioned domestic sense, a place where the heart keeps its accounts. The charm bore no name that matched any ledger in the municipal office, only a set of initials bent by time. Once, as a stranger stopped by the lane and happened to see the charm, she recognized a pattern she had seen in a tray of old charms at the market, the sort that sailors traded in the town beyond the river. The cat had been a traveler between parlors and alleys, and the charm was perhaps a log of someone's passage. For Zara, this made the cat's history more complicated and therefore more lovable. It was not only a found thing but a being who had lived several lives in one, and whose choices were as much about survival as about the soft permission of being held. Over time, neighbors began to tell the story of that night differently. At the tea stall, the telling leaned toward the comic, the image of men bellowing over a small cat, an elderly woman holding her ground, a shawl falling like an act of private warfare. At Mrs. Khan's bakery, the story felt more like repentance, a retelling where hands that had flung stones now bought extra scraps for the cat's bowl. In the grocer's boy's version, half apology, half self-justification, the story was a personal education in kindness. Stories change as they are told, but the core remained true. Something had altered the lane, and those who had been timid found a way to be kind. In small towns and narrower lanes, that is as near as one finds to civic repair, the cat itself, which had refused to be wholly owned or wholly free, became a kind of teacher. It showed all the animal's characteristic curiosity and inscrutability. One moment aloof, the next a warm weight at Zara's feet. Now a stalwart companion on a Sunday afternoon, and now the stealthy hunter of the alley's hidden mice. When winter sent a brittle wind through the lane, the cat would find the warmest corners and pretend with a feline dignity that its days had always been so arranged. When spring softened the stones, it was the first to smell the warmer ground and return to the spice crates with new treasures for the teacup. A found ribbon, a borrowed marble, a feather that seemed to have known better things. But resolution requires more than gentle domesticity. It requires the settlement of those threads that goods and laws attempt to tie. The owner, whose name had been a stamp in a municipal ledger, came to understand the subtle difference between possession and responsibility. He was a man who, when measured by the meters of his life, had much to be proud of. Shoes that glinted, accounts that balanced, a little house that sat sheltered from the wind. Yet he had not known how to sit quietly and look at a cat's breathing until he saw a woman place herself between the animal and men with papers. The sight lodged in him like an old uncomfortable truth, that things of value sometimes teach us to be better than the ledgers we keep. One Sunday, when the lane had resumed the easy cadence of shared work and small greetings, the owner came with a small parcel. He did not bring lawyers, nor did he make claims to entitlement. He brought awkwardly and with hands that had not known the gesture before, a small cushion for the cat, badly sewn perhaps, but neatly washed. He set it on the sill where the geranium now leaned, and the cat, who watched each human movement with the disdainful serenity of an aristocrat, accepted the cushion with a frown that equaled approval. He sat down and sat for longer than the routine of his visits had previously permitted, and when he rose he did so with a manner softened in a way that statutes do not soften. What, then, had been the final gift in this tale? Stories, particularly those told in a Kiplingian cadence of lesson and image, prefer to bestow one last present, both literal and symbolic. For this lane it came not as a miracle in the thunderous sense, but as a small, deliberate ritual. One evening, when Honey Sun had lowered to slant across the sill, the cat took in its mouth, carefully and without drama, the tiny tin charm that had been kept in Zara's teacup. It walked to the windowsill, climbed atop the plant's pot where the geranium's blossom shone like a small red flag, and set the charm upon the soil between the leaves as if placing an offering at a shrine. Then it looked up at Zara with eyes both humanly accusing and compassionately pleased. The gesture had the clarity of a fable made flesh. The charm was a small record of the cat's passage between lives. By placing it in the pot, the animal had made the geranium a repository of journeys. It was as if the cat were saying, "This is where I root my past. This is where I make my continuing." The act tied together all the threadbare things that had been set in motion. The plant that had foreshadowed growth, the shawl that had sheltered a small life, the charm that had been a traveler's token, and the human acts that had learned again how to answer a petition. Neighbors noticed. The man with polished shoes noticed and stood a long time at the doorway, watching as the token became a silent magnet on the soil. And Auntie Salima laughed softly as one laughs when a long cure is in a small act. The lane seemed smaller and kinder and contained within that moment a complete sort of absolution. Not because the law was satisfied, but because the community had invented a way to hold its children that was not merely about paper and punishment. The cat, as cats do, simply accepted the warmth of the moment, turned itself in the sun, and slept as if satisfied. Kipling wrote fables that end with a moral tucked under the tongue like a sweet, instructive, but not heavy-handed. If one were to draw a moral from this lane's small story, it would not be new, that kindness often asks for a small, individual courage. But the story yields a few subtler truths as well. First, that mercy, when practiced, tends to multiply. The saucer on the step begot bread from the bakery, which begot a boy's contrition, which begot a line of neighbors who learned to watch one another. Second, that law in its deficit of feeling must sometimes be mediated by human compassion. Paper rights are not the totality of justice. They are a frame that must be filled by human acts. Third, that animals are not simply mirrors for human virtue, but agents with their own wills and choices. The cat's decision to leap into the lane's dark, rather than be made into the prize of a ledger, was a refusal that refused to be domesticated by papers alone. And lastly, there is the universal truth of unexpected salvation, that a life which had been taught to live with grief could be tenderly altered by the warmth of another being. Zara learned that to receive is also to be responsible, that to bring someone in from the cold requires the patience to keep them. She learned that the ache of grief remains, not abolished, but companioned. The cat did not erase the past, but made it possible to bear it differently. She also learned that the small acts, a shared cup, a knitted cushion, a letter signed in the right spirit, matter more than the grand pronouncements men make when they would measure the worth of the world. Time, as always, performed its soft erasures. The municipal office filed its notes and moved on to other cases. The man with polished shoes learned to give a half-hour free of claims, and with it grew a competence in presence. The grocer's boy grew up a degree, not in paperwork but in kindness, and the lane took on an air of being slightly more civil because a single woman had refused to let a small heart be taken without contest. The geranium put out more blossoms and the teacup gathered more tokens. The little tin charm remained on the soil as a talisman that said, "Here is a place that keeps things safe in small ways." And there, in the hush that followed a long social trial, the cat made one most honest, ordinary offering. He took on a crisp morning when frost freckled the sill a single strand of the silver from Zara's old necklet, the one she had offered in exchange for a creature's life. And with a deftness that seemed to know the human heart, he nudged it beneath the geranium's leaf and then rubbed his head against Zara's palm, as if to say all is well. The silver loop was bent now, not an ornament but an artifact of exchange. It had become, in the cat's way, a final seal. The charm, the coin, the feather, the shawl, and now the silver. Together they made a small altar of belonging. The lane exhaled as neighbors walked by and glanced at the sill with the new familiarity of those who have seen something return whole. The cat slept often in the curve of Zara's lap, and sometimes chose to roam where it pleased. It was neither possession nor untouchable sovereign. Its life had acquired the messy dignity of being shared, a final truth, a moral. Mom and fathers had once thought too obvious to bother repeating, is that small acts of mercy do not leave those who perform them empty. Rather, they fill them slowly, like a well that is recharged by a trickle. Zara had been hollowed by loss, but the small habits of care built into her days. The tea left on the table, the bowl filled each afternoon, the hand extended without calculation, became the water that filled her emptiness. She did not become impervious to sorrow, but she became more humane toward herself and others. When the season turned and lilacs pushed out beyond the lane and the sun grew softer and long again, people would still remember the night the men in badges came and the strange bargain of a shawl and a necklace. They would tell the story to visiting relatives and to strangers who stopped by for directions. It would be told with some pride and a little shame, because that is the nature of stories that close with both an admission and a victory. The cat's presence in the lane became as commonplace as the morning steam from the bakery, and with that commonness came the truer miracle. A hum of life composed of small attentions, made steady by ordinary people who chose to answer, and Zara, older in a way that elegizes small victories, kept the photograph of the hands on the sill. It was not a relic demanding regret, but a companion to the cat who curled daily beneath the plant that had been a prophecy, and now a pledge. It was a life rewritten, not erased. The final gift of the cat, the tin charm set in the soil, the silver bent and hidden beneath the leaf, was not a neat parable but the living proof that what we tend will tend us back. And so the story finds its rest in a small, humane truth, that kindness is not an act but a habit. It is not a ledger item to be checked off but a slow occupation of every day. Ours that makes the world a place where the smallest petition, a tiny sound at a back door, can be answered, and in answering returns a life to its reason for waking. You stayed with me till the very end, thank you. If it felt like a soft purr in your heart, subscribing helps me share more stories like this.